Emma Caldwell's day had been ordinary, too ordinary for someone who thrived on chaos at work. She had spent 8 hours at the downtown legal firm, reviewing property contracts, filing minor complaints, and politely nodding through endless conference calls. But now, as she drove home through the quiet streets of Brookside Heights, she felt a shiver of relief. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the neat lawns of the suburban neighborhood she called home. The streetlights flickered intermittently, as though struggling against some unseen electrical fault. Emma glanced at the dashboard clock. 7:42 p.m. A chill ran down her spine, though she dismissed it as the leftover nerves from a long day. She slowed her car when she noticed a dark SUV parked several houses ahead. Its windows were tinted, hiding whoever or whatever might be inside. For a moment, Emma imagined the driver waving or signaling, but the vehicle remained motionless, its engine silent. There was no other reason for a stranger to be idling here, she thought, and her hands tightened around the steering wheel. Emma pulled into her driveway, the familiar comfort of home barely calming her nerves. As she grabbed her bag and keys, the streetlights flickered again, and then, suddenly, everything went black. The entire neighborhood was plunged into darkness as if the night had swallowed the streets whole. Emma froze, her pulse quickening. The darkness seemed heavier than the ordinary night. It pressed against her like a living thing. She fumbled for her phone, but the battery had drained down to nothing, leaving her in complete silence except for the faint hum of distant power lines. A shadow moved near the corner of her house. Emma's breath caught. At first, she thought it was a trick of her eyes, a branch swaying in the wind. Then she heard it, a whisper so soft it almost merged with the hum of the night. "Emma." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the door handle. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just the nerves talking. But the whisper came again, closer this time. She jerked the door open and stepped inside, her eyes scanning every corner. Nothing. She locked the door, sliding the bolt with a clink that sounded unnervingly loud in the silence. Emma leaned back against the door, trying to steady her breathing, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. It was there in every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that seemed to linger just beyond her line of sight. Emma turned toward the kitchen, hoping to charge her phone. That's when the lights flickered briefly, a violent strobe that cast grotesque shadows across the walls. For a split second, she thought she saw someone standing near the hallway, a silhouette so dark it seemed unreal. Her heart leapt into her throat. When the lights died again, the shadow was gone, but the fear remained, pulsing in the silence. She fumbled for the kitchen drawer, searching for the charger. Her fingers grazed a metal object instead, and she froze. Something heavy had been placed there, something that didn't belong. Panic surged. Emma's instincts screamed at her to leave, to run, but she couldn't see the door, couldn't be sure what was waiting in the dark beyond it. The phone clattered to the floor, bouncing against the tile with a sharp crack. She bent to pick it up, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. When she straightened, she was sure she wasn't alone. A movement in the corner of her eye, subtle but deliberate, made her spin. There was nothing there, but she knew better than to trust nothing. Emma backed toward the living room, trying to put the heaviest piece of furniture between herself and the open hallway. She pressed herself against the wall, her ear straining for the faintest sound. Outside, a wind rustled through the trees, and a distant car horn echoed like a warning. Then, a whisper, again. "Emma." She froze, recognizing the voice. It wasn't familiar, not someone she knew, but it was chillingly close, and it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. Her mind raced. Could someone have broken in while the blackout hit? Could it have been orchestrated, timed to perfection? Her thoughts darted to the mysterious SUV parked outside, the vehicle she'd noticed on her way in. The idea that someone had been following her all day, waiting for the blackout to strike, sent a jolt of fear straight to her chest. Emma tried to focus. She needed to stay calm, to think clearly, but her body betrayed her. Her legs trembled as she moved toward the kitchen again, each step careful, deliberate. She didn't want to run. Running would announce her presence, but hiding wasn't working either. Suddenly, there was a sharp click behind her. Emma spun, but the darkness swallowed the movement. The sound came again, a soft, deliberate step, approaching slowly, methodically. Emma backed into the living room corner, fumbling for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hand closed around the vase on the coffee table, cold and heavy, and she held it tightly, her knuckles whitening. Then, the lights flickered finally one last time. In that brief moment of illumination, Emma saw it. A figure, tall and dark, standing just beyond the doorway. She froze, unable to move, unable to scream, and then the lights went out again. Silence. Emma's last thought before the darkness seemed to swallow her completely was one of disbelief. How could something so ordinary, coming home, the quiet comfort of a suburban street, turn into a nightmare in a matter of seconds? The next morning, the neighborhood would wake to the hum of generators and the soft chatter of concerned neighbors. But Emma wouldn't be seen leaving her house. Her car remained in the driveway, her keys on the counter. The only clue that anything had happened was the faint flicker of the streetlights and a shattered phone screen lying in the kitchen floor. And somewhere, in the shadows of Brookside Heights, a black SUV disappeared into the night, carrying its secret away with it. The first light of dawn crept across Brookside Heights, casting long, pale shadows over lawns still damp with morning dew. For most of the neighborhood, it was just another quiet Saturday, except for the Caldwell residents. By 7:30 a.m., a small crowd had begun to gather outside Emma's house. Neighbors whispered anxiously, glancing at each other, trying to make sense of the situation. The front door was still closed, her car untouched in the driveway, and the faint smell of coffee still lingered in the air from the night before. But Emma? Emma was nowhere to be found. Detective Marcus Hayes arrived shortly after, parking his unmarked vehicle at the end of the street. Hayes had been a member of the Brookside Heights Police Department for nearly a decade, and in all that time, he had never felt the quiet tension that now gripped the neighborhood. Something about this case immediately unsettled him. He had dealt with petty thefts, domestic disputes, and the occasional vandalism, but disappearances were rare in this sleepy community. "Morning, Marcus," called Officer Linda Tran, her brow furrowed as she waved him over. "Neighbors are getting restless. Nobody's seen her since last night." Hayes nodded, his eyes scanning the street. "All right, let's start from the top. Door locked, car here, neighbors saw nothing unusual, except the blackout, right?" Tran hesitated. "Yes, that's what's got everyone spooked, and someone mentioned a black SUV parked nearby last night, but nobody got a clear look at it." Hayes frowned. "Black SUV. All right, that's our first lead. Let's see if anyone saw it leave." Inside the Caldwell house, the kitchen was a scene of quiet chaos. Emma's phone lay shattered on the floor, screen cracked, battery dead. A coffee cup was knocked over, staining the counter. Hayes went down, examining the phone, his brow furrowing. "Seems staged," he murmured. "Not a struggle exactly, but deliberate enough to leave her isolated." Outside, Mr. Linton, an elderly neighbor with a penchant for gossip, raised a shaky hand. I think I saw something last night. Around, I don't know, maybe 9:30? A shadow moving past the Caldwell house, and there was a vehicle, black, big, SUV-like. Couldn't see the driver." Hayes took notes. "And you're sure about the time?" "Well, clocks were all out with the blackout," Linton admitted, "but it felt late." Hayes looked around. No one else had anything useful to add, though anxious glances and whispered theories swirled through the small crowd. A rumor that Emma had left voluntarily began to circulate, though Hayes dismissed it immediately. He had worked long enough to know that sudden disappearances like this were rarely voluntary, especially when they coincided with a neighborhood-wide blackout. Hayes began walking the perimeter of the neighborhood, looking for evidence, footprints, tire tracks, anything that might indicate where Emma had gone. A faint trail in the soft mud near the curb caught his eye, dog prints possibly, and slightly deeper impressions. Something heavy had been dragged. He knelt, tracing the marks with gloved fingers. "Good," he muttered. "At least we have a trail." Back inside, Officer Tran was trying to piece together Emma's last known movements. Her calendar, nothing unusual yesterday, but emails. She'd been looking into some real estate issues, complaints about mismanaged property, shady deals. Hayes's ears perked up. Real estate? That's not usually life-threatening. Or is it? He leaned over her shoulder as she scrolled through the messages. Threatening emails, unsigned and vague, warned her to stop asking questions. Someone didn't want her digging too deep. Hayes felt a chill. The blackouts suddenly seemed more than coincidental. Someone had orchestrated it, timed it perfectly, to abduct Emma, to silence her. He moved toward the garage. The lock had been tampered with, small scratches marking the latch. Whoever had taken her clearly had done this before, someone meticulous, careful, and calculated. Hayes made a mental note. The SUV was likely involved. Whoever drove it knew the neighborhood, knew Emma's habits. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd began to grow restless. Rumors ran wild. Some suggested a neighbor was responsible. Some whispered about criminal organizations. Hayes knew that in moments like this, fear often clouded reason. Still, he couldn't ignore the possibility. Someone close to Emma might have betrayed her. Hayes called for additional units to search the surrounding streets and the abandoned industrial park nearby. It was a grim place, long unused, shadowed by overgrown weeds and crumbling brick walls, perfect for hiding someone or something. By midday, a breakthrough came from the surveillance cameras outside the neighborhood. The black SUV had left around the time of the blackout, but there was a second passenger inside, obscured in shadows. Hayes froze as he replayed the footage. "There's no mistake here," he said. "This was deliberate, planned, and they knew exactly what they were doing." He gathered the neighbors back together, keeping the mood cautious but firm. If anyone saw anything unusual, any lights, shadows, unfamiliar vehicles, now is the time to tell me. Every detail matters. One neighbor hesitated, then spoke up. I thought I saw someone near the industrial park last night. Couldn't tell who, but they moved fast, almost like they were carrying something." Hayes's pulse quickened. That fit the pattern: the dragged tracks outside Emma's house, the vehicle, the blackout, everything aligned like pieces of a grim puzzle. As evening approached, Hayes returned to the Caldwell home. The sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The normal suburban calm had shifted into something ominous. The empty driveway, the darkened windows, and the shattered phone all whispered the same chilling truth. Emma was in danger, and whoever had her was still out there. Hayes stared at the empty street, his jaw tight. The neighborhood looked safe, ordinary, but appearances were deceptive. He knew it. The calm could never last. And as darkness began to fall again, Hayes couldn't shake the sense that this was far from over. The first part of the investigation had begun. Clues were scarce, shadows were long, and every question seemed to lead to more uncertainty. Somewhere in the dark, Emma Caldwell was waiting, unaware that the net was slowly closing in around her abductors. And somewhere else, in the shadows, someone was watching the neighborhood, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The industrial park had long been abandoned, a relic of a time when factories hummed and trucks rumbled through its streets. Now it was silent, except for the occasional rustle of weeds in the wind and the faint groan of crumbling metal. Detective Marcus Hayes parked his unmarked car a few blocks away, crouching behind a chain-link fence to observe. He had been working non-stop since the morning. Neighbors had provided vague descriptions of unusual activity, the black SUV's movements had been tracked on neighborhood cameras, and Emma's phone and driveway clues had been analyzed, but nothing had led directly to her until now. Hayes scanned the perimeter of the warehouse district. Moonlight glinted off shattered windows, creating distorted reflections across puddles and cracked asphalt. Somewhere inside one of those derelict buildings, he felt certain Emma Caldwell was being held. The first clue came from a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping echoing through the night. Hayes froze, straining his ears. It wasn't a branch in the wind, it was deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Footsteps? Or something else? He approached carefully, sticking to the shadows. Each step crunched over broken glass, the sound loud in the quiet night. Hayes's mind replayed the details he had gathered, the threatening emails, the black SUV, the insider who may have helped orchestrate this. Emma had been targeted for something she discovered, something powerful people wanted hidden. A sudden movement caught his eye, a shadow slipping behind a stack of crates. Hayes raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the yard. Nothing, just more shadows and broken machinery, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Hayes entered one of the warehouses through a side door left slightly ajar. The air inside smelled of damp concrete and rust. Crates were stacked high, creating dark corridors and blind corners. His flashlight swept across the floor. Footprints, small, frantic, marred the dust, leading toward the back of the building. Then came the sound he would never forget, a soft, hoarse whisper. "Help me." Hayes's pulse quickened. "Emma!" He followed the voice, crouching low, moving slowly. Each step brought him closer to the sound of distress. The flashlight flickered over a half-open metal door, revealing a narrow passage that led to a small storage room. Inside, Emma sat on the floor, her hands bound with duct tape, her clothes disheveled and eyes wide with fear. Hayes's heart clenched. "Emma Caldwell?" he called softly. Her eyes widened, relief and terror mingling. "Detective Hayes, thank God." "Shh," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "We're going to get you out of here. Can you stand?" Emma nodded weakly, leaning on him as he helped her to her feet. Her body trembled, not just from fear, but exhaustion from the hour she had spent alone in darkness. Hayes glanced around, searching for the kidnapper. There was no one in sight, but the place smelled of danger, of something meticulously planned. As they began to move toward the exit, Hayes noticed something that made his stomach turn. Scrawled on the wall in black marker were numbers and names, coordinates, dates, and initials. Someone had been keeping detailed records of their victims, or maybe their plans. Hayes memorized the information quickly. This wasn't a random act. It was organized, cold, methodical. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the far wall, a figure stepping out from the darkness. Hayes raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the yard. Nothing, just more shadows and broken machinery, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Hayes entered one of the warehouses through a side door left slightly ajar. The air inside smelled of damp concrete and rust. Crates were stacked high, creating dark corridors and blind corners. His flashlight swept across the floor. Footprints, small, frantic, marred the dust, leading toward the back of the building. Then came the sound he would never forget, a soft, hoarse whisper. "Help me." Hayes's pulse quickened. "Emma!" He followed the voice, crouching low, moving slowly. Each step brought him closer to the sound of distress. The flashlight flickered over a half-open metal door, revealing a narrow passage that led to a small storage room. Inside, Emma sat on the floor, her hands bound with duct tape, her clothes disheveled and eyes wide with fear. Hayes's heart clenched. "Emma Caldwell?" he called softly. Her eyes widened, relief and terror mingling. "Detective Hayes, thank God." "Shh," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "We're going to get you out of here. Can you stand?" Emma nodded weakly, leaning on him as he helped her to her feet. Her body trembled, not just from fear, but exhaustion from the hours she had spent alone in darkness. Hayes glanced around, searching for the kidnapper. There was no one in sight, but the place smelled of danger, of something meticulously planned. As they began to move toward the exit, Hayes noticed something that made his stomach turn. Scrawled on the wall in black marker were numbers and names, coordinates, dates, and initials. Someone had been keeping detailed records of their victims, or maybe their plans. Hayes memorized the information quickly. This wasn't a random act. It was organized, cold, methodical. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the far wall, a figure stepping out from the darkness. Hayes raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the yard. Nothing, just more shadows and broken machinery. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Hayes entered one of the warehouses through a side door left slightly ajar. The air inside smelled of damp concrete and rust. Crates were stacked high, creating dark corridors and blind corners. His flashlight swept across the floor. Footprints, small, frantic, marred the dust, leading toward the back of the building. Then came the sound he would never forget. A soft, hoarse whisper. "Help me." Hayes's pulse quickened. "Emma!" He followed the voice, crouching low, moving slowly. Each step brought him closer to the sound of distress. The flashlight flickered over a half-open metal door, revealing a narrow passage that led to a small storage room. Inside, Emma sat on the floor, her hands bound with duct tape, her clothes disheveled and eyes wide with fear. Hayes's heart clenched. "Emma Caldwell?" he called softly. Her eyes widened, wounds and terror mingling. "Detective Hayes, thank God." "Shh," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "We're going to get you out of here. Can you stand?" Emma nodded weakly, leaning on him as he helped her to her feet. Her body trembled, not just from fear, but exhaustion from the hours she had spent alone in darkness. Hayes glanced around, searching for the kidnapper. There was no one in sight, but the place smelled of danger, of something meticulously planned. As they began to move toward the exit, Hayes noticed something that made his stomach turn. Scrawled on the wall in black marker were numbers and names, coordinates, dates, and initials. Someone had been keeping detailed records of their victims, or maybe their plans. Hayes memorized the information quickly. This wasn't a random act. It was organized, cold, methodical. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the far wall, a figure stepping out from the darkness. Hayes raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the yard. Nothing, just more shadows and broken machinery, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Hayes entered one of the warehouses through a side door left slightly ajar. The air inside smelled of damp concrete and rust. Crates were stacked high, creating dark corridors and blind corners. His flashlight swept across the floor. Footprints, small, frantic, marred the dust, leading toward the back of the building. Then came the sound he would never forget. A soft, hoarse whisper. "Help me." Hayes's pulse quickened. "Emma!" He followed the voice, crouching low, moving slowly. Each step brought him closer to the sound of distress. The flashlight flickered over a half-open metal door, revealing a narrow passage that led to a small storage room. Inside, Emma sat on the floor, her hands bound with duct tape, her clothes disheveled and eyes wide with fear. Hayes's heart clenched. "Emma Caldwell?" he called softly. Her eyes widened, relief and terror mingling. "Detective Hayes, thank God." "Shh," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "We're going to get you out of here. Can you stand?" Emma nodded weakly, leaning on him as he helped her to her feet. Her body trembled, not just from fear, but exhaustion from the hours she had spent alone in darkness. Hayes glanced around, searching for the kidnapper. There was no one in sight, but the place smelled of danger, of something meticulously planned. As they began to move toward the exit, Hayes noticed something that made his stomach turn. Scrawled on the wall in black marker were numbers and names, coordinates, dates, and initials. Someone had been keeping detailed records of their victims, or maybe their plans. Hayes memorized the information quickly. This wasn't a random act. It was organized. Detective Marcus Hayes parked his car in the lot behind the police station, engines still running, heart pounding. Emma Caldwell sat beside him, trembling, her hands still bound with duct tape from the warehouse. The city lights barely penetrated the early morning fog, giving the streets a surreal, ghostly quality. Hayes kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting the black SUV to appear again, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity. He had learned one thing in the past 24 hours. The people behind Emma's abduction were patient, careful, and dangerous. They weren't ordinary criminals. They were someone used to power, someone who could manipulate situations and bend fear to their will. Detective, Emma's voice broke the tense silence. Who would do this to me? Her blue eyes, wide and haunted, searched his for answers. Hayes shook his head. I don't know all of it yet, but someone in your neighborhood, someone with influence, knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't want you talking. Emma shivered. It was planned, from the blackout to the warehouse. Everything. Her voice faltered, and Hayes placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Emma, you're safe now, but we have to finish this. We have to find out who's behind it. By mid-morning, Hayes and a team of officers had returned to the industrial park. The warehouse had been cordoned off, forensic teams combing every corner for fingerprints, discarded tools, and traces of the SUV. Hayes's eyes scanned the wall where the numbers and initials had been scrawled. His gut told him this wasn't just random. It was a ledger, a careful record of crimes, threats, and blackmail. Then came the breakthrough. Surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store, initially overlooked, showed the black SUV returning to the industrial park late at night. But this time, Hayes noticed something chilling. The driver was someone he knew by reputation, a wealthy, respected real estate developer in Brookside Heights, Jonathan Crane. Crane's public persona was flawless. Philanthropic events, donations to the local school, a charming smile at every neighborhood meeting. But behind that facade was someone willing to kidnap, intimidate, and threaten anyone who threatened his empire. Hayes's blood ran cold. Crane wasn't just the mastermind, he had the resources, the influence, and the cunning to orchestrate the blackout, the SUV, and the abduction with near-perfect precision. Back at the station, Hayes confronted Emma with the evidence. Her eyes widened as she recognized the name. He owns half the properties I was investigating. He threatened me in emails. I thought it was just intimidation. It wasn't just intimidation, Hayes said grimly. It was calculated, and now we have to bring him down before he disappears again. The team moved quickly. Crane's mansion was imposing, gates locked, security cameras scanning every angle. Hayes coordinated with the SWAT team, planning entry points, backup routes, and contingencies. They couldn't underestimate him. When they arrived, Crane was waiting. He opened the door with a calm, almost amused expression. Detective Hayes, he said smoothly, I suppose this is about Emma Caldwell. Yes, Hayes said, his voice cold. You're under arrest for kidnapping, intimidation, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Crane's smile never wavered. Kidnapping? My dear detective, you misunderstand. Emma came to me willingly. She merely misunderstood my intentions. Hayes stepped closer, ignoring the man's theatrics. Your lies end now, Crane. We have evidence, surveillance, witnesses, Emma's testimony, the warehouse ledger. Every step of your plan is documented. Crane's eyes flickered, for the first time showing a crack in his composed mask. You
You don't understand. I'm protecting more than my investments. If the truth comes out, the community, my reputation, it would all crumble. People's lives matter more than your reputation, Hayes shot back, and it's time you paid for what you did. Emma, still trembling, stepped forward. He tried to scare me, to silence me, but I won't stay quiet anymore. People need to know the truth. Crane's expression darkened. You'll regret this. But it was too late. SWAT moved in swiftly, securing Crane and his men. Hayes stayed close to Emma as the scene unfolded, realizing the nightmare that had begun with a simple blackout was finally ending. Back at the station, Emma gave a formal statement, recounting the night she vanished, the threats she had received, and every detail she remembered from the warehouse. Her voice, though shaken, carried determination. Hayes knew the bravery it took to relive those moments. News spread quickly. The neighborhood buzzed with disbelief. Jonathan Crane, the respected real estate developer, was behind Emma's abduction. Questions that once seemed trivial, like the sudden blackout or the black SUV parked on the street, now made horrifying sense. People who had trusted him were left stunned and scared. As Hayes watched Emma leave the station, free but forever changed by the events of the past night, he reflected on the fragility of appearances. In Brookside Heights, everyone seemed ordinary, but darkness had a way of hiding behind even the most polished facades. Emma turned to him before getting into a police escort vehicle. "Thank you, Detective. I don't know what I would have done without you." Hayes nodded. "Just remember, stay vigilant. Darkness isn't always about night. Sometimes it's the people you think you know." Even as justice had been served, Hayes felt a lingering unease. The ledger in the warehouse suggested Crane wasn't alone. Others had been implicated in his schemes. The neighborhood's quiet charm had been shattered, replaced by suspicion, fear, and the knowledge that even familiar streets could hide dangerous secrets. As the sun began to rise over Brookside Heights, casting light over the quiet streets, Hayes knew that while Emma was safe, the shadows that lingered in the hearts of the powerful were far from gone. And somewhere in the distance, a black SUV was being loaded onto a tow truck, ready to be studied for evidence, a silent reminder that the night the lights went out had changed everything.